I'm Rachel Donovan, though for 10 years, the financial world knew me as Claire Hartman. And this is the story of how I went from being the forgotten daughter of Chicago's banking royalty to the woman who brought down a 100-year dynasty, my own. Everyone said I was the sweet one, the peacemaker who'd never hurt a fly. But I was actually building the most elaborate takedown in banking history, and my own family had no idea they were funding their own destruction. Before I expose how I shocked my family's business when they tried to take what was mine, drop a comment and let me know if you have ever been betrayed by a family member you loved so much, and subscribe to hear more stories about standing up for yourself. Let me take you back to where it all started. Growing up in Chicago's North Shore was like living in a snow globe, beautiful, pristine, and completely suffocating. The Donovan name carried weight in the city. We weren't just wealthy, we were legacy. Donovan Banking Group had been financing Chicago's growth since the 1920s, and my father, Charles Donovan, never let anyone forget it. But here's what you need to understand about family dynasties. They're only as strong as their chosen heir. And I was never the chosen one. Daniel, my older brother, was everything my father wanted in a successor. Tall, charming, with that easy confidence that made clients feel like their money was in safe hands. He had father's blue eyes and mother's diplomatic smile, and from the moment he could walk, everyone knew he'd inherit the throne. Me? I was the afterthought. The daughter who asked too many questions and cried when the numbers didn't add up. Too emotional for finance, father would say, dismissing my ideas with a wave of his manicured hand. Banking isn't about feelings, Rachel. It's about trust and tradition. I still remember the day I presented my digital banking proposal to the board. I was 25, fresh out of Wharton with a head full of revolutionary ideas. I'd spent months researching how technology could transform traditional banking, how we could reach younger demographics, how we could modernize without losing our prestige. I walked into that mahogany-paneled boardroom wearing my best suit, my presentation perfectly rehearsed. The board members, all men over 50, sat around that massive oak table like judges at a trial. Gentlemen, I began. The future of banking is digital. We're sitting on a goldmine of client data and traditional trust, but we're losing ground to fintech startups every quarter. I showed them my projections, my market analysis, my 5-year growth plan. When I finished, the room was silent for exactly 15 seconds. Then my father started laughing. "Rachel, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This isn't Silicon Valley. Our clients don't want to bank on their phones. They want to sit across from someone they trust, shake hands on deals, look us in the eye. That's what the Donovan name means. Personal service and old-fashioned reliability." The other board members nodded along like bobbleheads. Daniel, sitting at father's right hand, didn't even look up from his phone. "But the data shows..." I started. "The data shows you've been spending too much time with those tech nerds in California," father interrupted. "This is a family business, Rachel. Maybe it's time you focused on what you do best, supporting your brother's vision for the company." That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom, staring at the rejection letter from Harvard Business School that I'd never thrown away. It was a reminder of my first real failure, my first taste of being deemed not quite good enough. But now I realized it wasn't a failure at all. It was a blessing in disguise. 3 weeks later, I did something my family never expected. I disappeared. New York City doesn't care about your last name. It doesn't care about your family legacy or your trust fund or the weight of expectations crushing your chest. It only cares about what you can do, and I could do plenty. Claire Hartman was born on a Tuesday in a small apartment in Hell's Kitchen. Legally, she was just an LLC filing, but practically, she was my rebirth. I chose the name carefully, Claire meaning clear or bright, and Hartman as a subtle nod to my grandmother's maiden name. She would have loved the irony. I used my trust fund as seed money, claiming I was taking time to find myself in Europe. My parents were so relieved to have their embarrassing daughter out of the spotlight that they didn't ask many questions. Daniel got a good laugh out of it at family gatherings, apparently joking about his flighty sister, who couldn't handle the real world. If only they knew I was building their replacement just 2 states away. Hartman Capital started small, me, one hired assistant, and a rented office space that smelled like the Korean restaurant downstairs. But I had something most fintech startups didn't. I understood old money. I knew how traditional wealth thought, how it moved, what it feared. My first major client was Margaret Sinclair, a 70-year-old widow whose late husband had built a shipping empire. She came to me because her current financial advisors treated her like a decorative vase, something pretty to place investments around, but not someone capable of understanding real strategy. Mrs. Sinclair, I told her during our first meeting, your advisors are bleeding you dry with fees because they think you won't notice. They're wrong. I showed her exactly how much she was losing to unnecessary management fees, outdated investment strategies, and pure condescension. Then I showed her my plan: higher returns, lower fees, and most importantly, complete transparency. Why should I trust you? She asked, her sharp eyes studying my face. You're what, 30? What do you know about protecting wealth? I know that everyone underestimates women in finance, I said. And I know that smart money follows results, not reputation. 6 months later, Margaret's portfolio had outperformed the market by 12%. She told her friends. They told their friends. And suddenly, Claire Hartman was the whispered name in Manhattan's most exclusive circles. But I wasn't just building a client base. I was building an empire. By year 3, Hartman Capital was managing over $2 billion in assets. By year 5, we'd expanded into corporate consulting and strategic acquisitions. By year 7, I was fielding calls from Forbes and Fortune, though I always declined interviews. Claire Hartman remained mysteriously private, which only added to her mystique. But here's what none of my glowing clients knew. Every move I made was strategically positioning me for one ultimate goal: the complete acquisition of Donovan Banking Group. I started small, purchasing debt from companies that did business with my family's bank. Nothing obvious, nothing that would trigger their attention. A construction loan here, a small business credit line there. Paper transactions that looked routine but gave me insight into Donovan Banking's client base, their interest rates, their approval processes. I discovered something interesting in those files. My brother Daniel was approving loans that didn't meet our family's traditionally conservative standards. Big loans, risky loans, loans to companies with questionable financials. At first, I thought he was just being aggressive in a competitive market. Then I dug deeper. Daniel had been stealing money for 3 years. Not large amounts, he was too smart for that. But consistent amounts, skimmed from loan processing fees, buried in administrative costs, hidden in the maze of corporate accounting that Father had never bothered to modernize. And Father knew. I found the paper trail in a batch of documents I'd purchased during a routine debt acquisition. Internal memos discussing Daniel's situation, references to covering shortfalls, and most damning of all, a wire transfer from Father's personal account to cover a client investment that Daniel had borrowed from. They weren't just covering for his theft, they were covering for his addiction habit that was funding it. My sweet, beloved father and golden boy brother weren't just running a traditional family business. They were running a house of cards, held together by reputation, secrecy, and the hope that no one would look too closely at the books. That's when I knew exactly how this story would end. Years 8 through 10 of my exile were a masterpiece of strategic patience. While Daniel was spiraling deeper into his addictions and Father was growing more paranoid about outside threats to the family business, I was quietly acquiring influence over everything that mattered to them. I bought the debt on their country club. I became the primary lender to 3 of their biggest commercial clients. I purchased the mortgage on the building that housed their downtown offices. One by one, I was surrounding them with my own power, but they had no idea because they'd never bothered to learn who Claire Hartman really was. The beautiful irony? They were actually proud of their mysterious rival in New York. At family gatherings, which I attended faithfully, playing the role of the sweet, Scattered daughter who never quite found her calling. Father would rant about this Hartman woman who was disrupting traditional banking with all her flashy technology. She's exactly what's wrong with finance today, he'd say, cutting his prime rib with unnecessary aggression. No respect for relationship banking, no understanding of legacy clients. She'll crash and burn like all these tech companies. Daniel would nod along, though I noticed his hands shaking slightly when he reached for his wine glass. The addiction was taking its toll, but he hid it well in public. He'd gained weight around his middle, lost some of that golden boy glow, but the family reputation machine kept spinning stories of his brilliance and innovation. I heard Hartman Capital tried to poach the Morrison account, Daniel said one Christmas, his pupils slightly too dilated for the dim dining room lighting. Offered them rates we couldn't match. Desperate tactics. I smiled sweetly. It must be frustrating competing with someone so ambitious. Frustrating. Father laughed. It's amusing. Let her play with her apps and algorithms. Real banking is about trust, and trust takes generations to build. The Donovan name means something in this city. If only he knew that the Donovan name was about to mean something very different. By the winter of my 10th year as Claire Hartman, I owned or controlled 60% of Donovan Banking Group's critical business relationships. I'd never made a hostile move, never filed a complaint, never even met them in any official capacity. I'd simply been patient, strategic, and utterly ruthless in ways they could never imagine their emotional daughter could be. The final piece fell into place on a Tuesday in November. The Kelman Group, one of Father's oldest and most prestigious clients, came to me with the problem. They needed bridge financing for a major acquisition, the kind of deal that would net Donovan Banking a seven-figure fee. But they needed an answer in 48 hours, and Donovan Banking's approval process took a minimum of 2 weeks. Ms. Hartman, Richard Kelman said during our video call, we've been with Donovan for 40 years, but business is business. Can you help us or not? Mr. Kelman, I replied, I can have the funds transferred by Friday. But I need something in return. Name it. I need you to recommend that Donovan Banking consider a strategic partnership with a private equity firm that's been watching their performance very closely. Which firm? I smiled. One that understands the value of tradition but isn't afraid of innovation. I'll have my people send over the details. That Friday, Richard Kelman called my father personally to suggest that Donovan Banking Group might benefit from fresh capital and a strategic partnership with Hartman Capital. Father's response was predictable. Over my dead body will I partner with that woman. But Daniel, who was present for the call and desperately needed a win to distract from his growing problems, had a different reaction. Maybe we should at least hear them out, he said. Times are changing, and we can't ignore market realities forever. For the first time in our family's history, Daniel disagreed with Father in front of a client. The golden boy was finally showing some independence, or maybe the addiction was just making him paranoid about the bank's future. Either way, I had my opening. The invitation came in early November, delivered by my assistant with barely concealed excitement. Ms. Hartman, Donovan Banking Group has requested a preliminary meeting to discuss potential strategic opportunities. They'd like to arrange a call for next week. I leaned back in my office chair, looking out over Manhattan's glittering skyline. 10 years of planning were about to culminate in a single phone call. But I had a better idea. Decline the meeting, I told her. Tell them Ms. Hartman has a prior commitment, but would be delighted to discuss opportunities after the holidays. But ma'am, this is exactly what we've been working toward. Trust me, I said. Good things come to those who wait. 3 days later, I called my mother. Mom, it's Rachel. I know I've missed a few family gatherings lately, but I was hoping to come home for Thanksgiving this year. I have some news to share with everyone. Mother's voice brightened immediately. Oh, darling, that would be wonderful. Your father will be so pleased. Daniel's bringing that new girlfriend of his, Ashley or Amber, something with an A. It'll be nice to have both my children home. Perfect, I said. I can't wait to catch up with everyone. Thanksgiving Day arrived crisp and cold, with the kind of Chicago wind that cuts through even the most expensive wool coat. I stood on my childhood home's front steps, holding a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and took a deep breath. Rachel Donovan was about to attend her last family dinner. Claire Hartman was about to make her debut. The house looked exactly the same. Massive stone facade, perfectly manicured landscaping, the kind of intimidating wealth that whispered rather than shouted. I could hear laughter and conversation drifting from the dining room as I let myself in through the front door. Rachel. Mother rushed over, resplendent in cream silk and pearls. You look wonderful, darling. I love what you've done with your hair. It was shorter now, sharper, styled by the same woman who did hair for Manhattan's power brokers. I'd also upgraded my wardrobe significantly. This dress had cost more than I used to spend on clothes in 6 months. Thanks, Mom. You look beautiful as always. Father appeared from his study, scotch in hand, looking older than his 68 years. The stress of covering for Daniel's problems was showing in the lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. There's my girl, he said, giving me a perfunctory hug. What is it you're doing now? Consulting. Something like that, I said. Actually, I have some exciting news to share over dinner. Daniel emerged from the living room with a woman who was definitely too young for him and definitely not his wife. His marriage had ended 2 years ago, another casualty of his addictions, though the family had spun it as irreconcilable differences. Hey sis, he said, his pupils slightly constricted. He was high but trying to hide it. This is Amber. Amber, my little sister Rachel. Amber giggled and waved. She couldn't have been older than 25. Lovely to meet you, I said, shaking her perfectly manicured hand. Daniel's told me so much about you. This was a lie. Daniel and I barely spoke anymore, but social pleasantries were important for what came next. Dinner conversation followed the usual patterns. Father pontificating about the bank's performance, Mother trying to keep things light with questions about my little consulting business, Daniel making inappropriate jokes about his divorce, while Amber laughed at everything he said. It was almost nostalgic. You know, Father said, cutting into his prime rib, we've been getting interest from some private equity groups lately. All these vultures circling, thinking they can modernize banking with their computers and algorithms. Dad, maybe we should at least consider, Daniel started. Absolutely not, Father interrupted. The Donovan name stands for something. We don't need outside money, and we certainly don't need some Manhattan investment firm telling us how to run the business my grandfather built. What kind of firms? I asked innocently. Oh, you wouldn't know them, sweetheart. High finance, very complicated. There's this one group, Hartman Capital, that's been particularly persistent. The woman who runs it thinks she can just waltz in and tell us how to do business. I set down my fork and reached into my purse, pulling out a leather portfolio. Actually, Dad, I know Hartman Capital quite well. The table went quiet. In fact, I continued, sliding a document across the table. I am Hartman Capital. Father's face went through several interesting color changes as he stared at the signature line. Claire Hartman, CEO and founder. Rachel Donovan, legal name. I don't understand, Mother whispered. It's quite simple, I said, my voice calm and clear. 10 years ago, when you all decided I was too emotional for banking, I moved to New York and built my own firm. I've been operating under the name Claire Hartman, grandmother's maiden name, if you remember. And for the past decade, I've been systematically acquiring strategic positions in your business relationships. I pulled out more documents, spreading them across the mahogany table like playing cards. I own the debt on this house. I own the mortgage on your downtown offices. I hold controlling interest in 60% of your major client relationships. And as of yesterday, I own enough Donovan Banking Group stock to force a board vote on new management. Daniel's face had gone completely white. That's impossible. Is it? I looked directly at him. Because according to these financial records, you've been stealing from client accounts for 3 years. And Dad, these bank transfers show you've been covering for him. Father's Scotch glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. The addiction habit is expensive, isn't it, Daniel? I continued. Though I have to admire your creativity in hiding the theft. Skimming loan processing fees, inflating administrative costs, borrowing from client investment accounts, and hoping they wouldn't notice. Very innovative for someone who's supposedly bad with technology. Amber looked confused. Mother looked like she might faint. Father looked like he might have a heart attack. But I wasn't done. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice steady as a surgeon's hand. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling an emergency board meeting. I'll be presenting evidence of the theft, the cover-up, and the systematic mismanagement that's put our family's bank at risk of federal investigation. Rachel, please, Mother started. I'm not Rachel anymore, I said gently. Rachel was the daughter who begged for approval and got dismissed. I'm Claire Hartman now, and Claire Hartman owns this bank. Father finally found his voice. You can't do this. This is your family. This is your legacy. My legacy? I laughed, a sound that surprised even me with its bitterness. My legacy was being told I was too emotional, too soft, too feminine for finance. My legacy was watching you promote my addicted, thieving brother while dismissing every innovative idea I brought to the table. I stood up, smoothing my dress. But you're right about one thing. This is my family, which is why I'm giving you a choice. I pulled out one final document. Option 1. Daniel enters rehab immediately. Both of you resign from the board. I restructure the bank, bring it into the 21st century, and salvage what's left of the Donovan reputation. You keep your personal assets, your country club memberships, your dignity. And option 2? Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. Option 2, I let the federal investigation proceed naturally. They'll discover the theft on their own, along with the shady business deals that I'm pretty sure is connected to your drug purchases. The bank collapses, the family name becomes a cautionary tale, and you both spend the next decade in federal prison. The silence stretched for exactly 30 seconds. You've changed, Father said finally. No, I replied. I've just stopped pretending to be someone you could love. I walked to the door, then turned back one last time. The board meeting is Monday at 9 a.m. I suggest you both prepare your resignation letters. Rachel, Mother called out, tears streaming down her face. Please, there has to be another way. I looked at her, this woman who had stood by while her husband dismissed her daughter's ambitions, who had smiled politely while her son destroyed himself with drugs and nearly destroyed the family business. There was another way, I said softly. It was called believing in me. Monday morning arrived with unusual clarity. The Chicago skyline looked different from the 42nd floor of Donovan Banking Group. It looked like territory I was about to conquer rather than a place I'd fled from. The boardroom hadn't changed much since my disastrous presentation 15 years earlier. Same mahogany table, same portraits of stern-faced Donovan men glaring down from the walls, same atmosphere of old money and older thinking. But the people sitting around that table were about to get a very different kind of education. Gentlemen, I began, standing at the head of the table in a power suit that cost more than some cars. My name is Claire Hartman, and I now own controlling interest in this bank. The faces around the table showed various stages of confusion and alarm. These men had heard whispers about the mysterious Hartman woman, but seeing her in person, seeing that she was Charles Donovan's own daughter, was clearly not what they'd expected. I've called this emergency meeting to address several critical issues that threaten not just the bank's profitability, but its very existence. I clicked my presentation remote. The first slide showed a comprehensive financial analysis of the bank's performance over the past 5 years, declining market share, rising operational costs, and most damning of all, a detailed breakdown of the theft scheme. For 3 years, this institution has been hemorrhaging money due to internal theft and gross mismanagement. The perpetrators of these crimes have been protected by a culture of secrecy and nepotism that ends today. Board member Henry Walsh, father's oldest friend, cleared his throat. "Now see here, young lady." "Mr. Walsh," I interrupted, "unless you'd prefer to explain to federal investigators why you never questioned the irregularities in our loan processing department, I suggest you let me finish." His mouth snapped shut. For the next hour, I laid out everything. Daniel's theft scheme, traced through financial records and corroborated with bank surveillance footage. Father's complicity, documented in emails and wire transfers. The systematic failure of oversight that had allowed both crimes to continue. But I didn't stop there. I showed them my vision for the bank's future: digital transformation, expanded services, strategic partnerships with fintech companies. Everything I'd proposed 15 years ago, now backed by a decade of proven success and the financial muscle to make it happen. "The choice is simple," I concluded. "Evolve or die. Fight me and face federal investigation, or embrace change and prosper." The vote was unanimous. Daniel and Father submitted their resignations that afternoon. Father's letter was brief and bitter. Daniel's was longer, rambling, and showed clear signs of someone writing while under the influence. Both men were escorted from the building by security, a detail I hadn't requested, but that the new head of security thought was appropriate. By Wednesday, the Chicago Tribune was running headlines about the prodigal daughter's return and the Hartman Revolution. By Friday, the Wall Street Journal had picked up the story, dubbing me the banking heiress who built her own empire. The narrative was perfect, too perfect to be accidental. I'd spent years crafting Claire Hartman's reputation, and now I was reaping the benefits. The financial world loves a good comeback story, especially one involving a brilliant woman proving her doubters wrong. 6 months later, Hartman Donovan Financial was the most talked about regional bank in the Midwest. We'd launched the digital platform I dreamed of as a 25-year-old, but with the credibility and resources that only came with decades of traditional banking. Our client base had grown by 40%. Our profit margins had improved by 30%. Most importantly, our employee satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs as I'd systematically replaced the old boys club with a diverse team of actual finance professionals. But the most satisfying change was personal. I kept my office on the 42nd floor, but I'd redecorated completely. Gone were the heavy drapes and intimidating oil paintings. In their place, floor-to-ceiling windows, modern art, and a view of Lake Michigan that reminded me every day that I'd built something beautiful from the ashes of something broken. My assistant knocked and entered. "Miss Hartman, your 3 o'clock is here. Send her in." Margaret Sinclair walked into my office, moving with the same sharp confidence that had impressed me a decade ago in New York. She was one of several clients who'd followed me from Hartman Capital to the new venture. "Claire," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I have to say, this whole revelation has been the most entertaining thing to happen in Chicago since the Cubs won the World Series." I laughed. "I'm glad you're amused." "Amused?" "Darling, I'm inspired. Do you know how many women my age have been dismissed by their own families? How many daughters have been told they're not suited for the family business?" She leaned forward. "You didn't just prove them wrong. You bought them out. That's not revenge. That's artistry." "It wasn't about revenge," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I wondered if they were entirely true. "It was about building something better." "And what about them? Your father and brother?" I considered the question. Father had moved to their house in Florida, claiming he needed time to reassess his priorities. Translation: he was too embarrassed to show his face at the country club. Mother had followed him, though she called me every few weeks to check in, with conversations that were equal parts guilt and poorly disguised attempts to gauge my mood. Daniel was in rehab, his 3rd attempt, but the first that seemed to be taking. His girlfriend had left him when the money dried up, which was probably the best thing that could have happened to him. I'd established a trust fund to cover his treatment and basic living expenses, with the stipulation that he maintain sobriety and stay out of banking permanently. They're learning to live with the consequences of their choices, I said finally. Just like I learned to live with mine. And are you happy with your choices? It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Was I happy? I was successful, respected, financially secure beyond my wildest dreams. I'd proven every doubter wrong and built an empire that would outlast any of the men who dismissed me. But happiness? That was harder to quantify. I'm satisfied, I said. I'm proud of what we've built here. And for the first time in my life, I don't need anyone's approval to know my own worth. Margaret smiled. That, my dear, is worth more than all the revenge in the world. 1 year later, I was invited to speak at the Chicago Economic Club, the same organization where my father had been a keynote speaker for 20 years. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially the reporters who'd gathered to cover the most anticipated business speech of the decade. I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of Chicago's financial elite. Many of these faces had been at Daniel's promotion announcement, Father's award ceremonies, the countless events where the Donovan men had been celebrated while I'd been relegated to polite applause and patronizing smiles. 3 years ago, I was told that I was too emotional for finance, that I didn't understand tradition, that I couldn't be trusted with serious money, that I should focus on supporting other people's visions instead of pursuing my own. The audience was completely silent. Today, Hartman Donovan Financial is the fastest-growing regional bank in the Midwest. We've revolutionized customer service, embraced technological innovation, and proven that tradition and progress aren't mutually exclusive, they're complementary. I clicked to my final slide, a photograph of our newest office, a gleaming tower that would house our expanded operations and serve as headquarters for our upcoming national expansion. But the most important lesson I've learned isn't about banking or business or even revenge, I continued. It's about the difference between being heard and being listened to. I looked directly at Henry Walsh, Father's old friend who still attended these events despite his forced retirement from our board. For years, I spoke and no one listened. I had ideas and no one cared. I had vision and no one believed. So I stopped trying to make them listen, and I started building something worth hearing. The applause was immediate and sustained. As I left the podium, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall behind the stage. The woman looking back at me was confident, successful, and completely comfortable in her own power. She looked nothing like the forgotten daughter who'd fled Chicago 15 years ago. She looked like someone whose voice mattered. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just success. It's becoming so undeniably powerful that the people who dismissed you have no choice but to finally listen. What would you do if you had unlimited resources and 10 years to prove your worth? Let me know in the comments below. If you want more interesting, relatable stories, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notification for more.